Our next presenter is Brandon Weichert. Brandon is a recent alum of IWP. He is a geopolitical analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy and Eurasian affairs. He's the founder of the Weichert Report, a world news website, as well as a contributing editor for American Greatness. Brandon Weichert graduated from DePaul University with a BA in political science. Has an MA in Statecraft and National Security Affairs with a specialization in defense policy from IWP. He's also an associate member of New College at Oxford University and previously served on a congressional staff as a congressional staff member. Recently, Mr. Weichert was invited to become a lecturer for the Kosciuszko Chair of Polish Studies at the Institute of World Politics. In this role, Brandon has spoken on various topics such as the rise of Erdogan's new empire in Turkey, the true ambitions of Russian foreign policy, does Europe need nukes? And he was asked by the Polish-American Congress to speak at the House Polish Caucus on the German-French-Russian alliance and its threat to Poland. He is a contributing editor for American Greatness and has been a prolific writer for Real Clear Politics and other publications. Ladies and gentlemen, keep your eyes on this young man. He is doing some interesting work in the media and on behalf of his country.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. I should also note I am contractually obligated to announce that I, last week, was made a fellow at the Eurasian Research Institute in Washington, Eurasian Research and Analysis Institute in Washington, D.C., so put that out there as well. In 1904, the great Sir Alfred Kinder wrote a treatise on geopolitics at that time called The Geographical Pivot of History. And he said back then, who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island, which is Eurasia, Europe and Asia, commands the world. And I like to say that today, in the modern 21st century environment, who rules the air commands low Earth orbit. Who rules low Earth orbit commands space. Who rules space commands the fate of mankind. Space is our future. Space is the modern world. It has made the modern world possible. And space will either make or break us in the next unfortunate period of great power conflict, which we are inching ever closer toward. Space warfare is here. Every conflict we've fought since Desert Storm has been a space war on some point, on some level. Desert Storm was considered America's first space war. This is not my words. This is the words of the Pentagon in the after-action report on Operation Desert Storm. The famous General Norman Schwarzkopf, Stormin' Norman, his famous left hook in the desert that caught the Iraqi armored brigades off guard in Kuwait was conducted exclusively with the assistance of Global Positioning System satellites. Those beautiful pictures of the bombs dropping on the targets in Iraq that the CNN played over and over again during that conflict were provided by satellites. The Balkan interventions during the Clinton years were exclusively made possible. The usage of heavy air power with limited ground interdiction was thanks to satellites. The conflict in Afghanistan, whatever our opinion of it is today, in the initial period, in the few days after 9/11, we were able to insert a handful of CIA jawbreaker teams and Special Forces A teams that linked up with local Afghan fighters, and we used satellites to basically act as force multipliers. It allowed our troops, our handful of guys on the ground, to really pummel to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda while the Pentagon got its primary forces activated and ready to go. Iraq, the 21-day push into Baghdad. Again, whatever our opinions on that war, how it ended, the initial phase was quite successful in toppling the Saddam Hussein regime with a relative small number of U.S. forces, about 150,000 American and British troops and some other coalition forces, the Thunder Run, and also the bin Laden raid of 2011. That was exclusively the result, not just of the great special forces operators, but it was made possible by satellite linkages in space. Right now, America's global military dominance depends upon easy and open access of space. And that is the one area where our adversaries, particularly China, but also Russia, though not to the same extent because I believe they're a declining power, also Iran and North Korea with their rogue nuclear programs, that is the one domain in which our enemies are exclusively targeting our dominance, because they realize that if you can remove America's space capabilities, you've essentially made America's military deaf, dumb, and blind. All of our adversaries exist over the horizon. That means that we have to project power into their what they consider to be their spheres of influence, their backyards. So we have to have satellites. We have to have easy and open access to space in order to make our military operate in a fully efficient manner. The U.S. military, for its part, needs to have a handful of systems that it does not currently have. First of all, we need to have defensive satellites. Right now, our adversaries, again, particularly China, have created weapon systems like the pictured anti-satellite weapons. These are basic missiles that are relatively cheap for a power like China to launch at our satellites. They can track them in orbit, and they can launch them and knock them out. We need to create kind of like a Secret Service agent, the way he jumps in front of the president if a gun is fired at him. In the same capacity, we need to create defensive satellites that can deflect an incoming missile. We also need, because of the threat of North Korea and Iran, we desperately need a space-based anti-nuclear weapons defense system, Star Wars, what Reagan was talking about, President Reagan was talking about in '83. At the time, there were technical limitations, but today we've overcome many of those problems. It's a simple question of funding and political will. We have the knowledge base. It's just an issue of political will and funding. And of course, the Russians and Chinese, every time this comes up, they start to cry foul. But I'm with my friend David Goldman, who writes for the Asia Times Online. He's an Asia expert. He always jokes, he tells me that he unfortunately was responsible for George Soros making his money in the 90s in Asia. He tells me, you know, what we need to be telling the Russians and Chinese is, hey, look, we trusted you guys to keep your clients, namely Iran and North Korea, in check, but because you did not, we're going to have to develop space-based anti-nuclear weapon systems. We also, in the 1950s and 60s, the Air Force had a manned military space program. It was called the Manned Orbital Laboratory, MOL for short. We actually had Air Force and naval officers who were trained in this military space program. They were called MOL men. And at the last moment, the systems were about to be deployed in orbit, but at the last minute, Nixon decided to cut the program and folded it into the Skylab program for NASA. It was never quite the same. The idea behind the MOL system was they would be a manned satellite. And the reason you would man it is because at the time it would raise the cost of doing an attack on American space systems on the Soviets considerably high. When you have an unmanned system, our enemies go, we're not going to actually kill any Americans, so the ability for them to retaliate will be much greater reduced. But if there are Americans that are in direct jeopardy because of an enemy attack, the likelihood increases that the United States would directly respond because our guys are getting killed. And so I think that one of the things we hear a lot about in nuclear deterrence is the use of American troops in Eastern Europe, for instance, as tripwires. I think a better use of tripwires would be in space. You put a couple of American astronauts on a manned orbital laboratory type system, and it's highly unlikely that either the Chinese or Russians are going to take the risk of igniting America's furor over that issue. There's another system that we would like to get called rods from God, as the Air Force nicknamed them. They're giant tungsten rods in orbit that have the ability to threaten an enemy stronghold or an enemy capital with rapid launch. It's not nuclear, and so there'd be no radioactive fallout. The key problem with all of these systems is cost. Whether we're talking about deploying current military satellites, or we're talking about trying to create these next generation defensive and offensive weapon systems, a critical problem is cost. Right now, the Pentagon's procurement process is entirely predicated on a system that was put in place by Robert McNamara. And so this has created highly ineffective, highly costly methodologies for deploying even the most rudimentary military space system. And now remember, without space, our military really isn't able to have the dominant position it is able to have. And so it beggars disbelief when you see the fact that our Pentagon has not reformed this onerous and bloated procurement system. We rely on the same handful of major contractors. Now, these folks do great work. I'm not knocking at them, but the problem is they're almost too big to fail now. We've almost created quasi-state-owned enterprises with especially United Launch Alliance, which is the Pentagon, which is the Air Force in combination with Lockheed Martin and Boeing. The reason that they use these two big entities is because they have the logistical supply chain. But as you can see from this quote, Taylor Lincoln, who's the director of the Congress Watch Division of Public Citizen, which is a national nonprofit consumer advocacy organization, he says if you're a startup, you almost certainly won't get a chance to sell your product or service to the U.S. government. This is California. This is the hub of startups. Look at what startups have done at cost. So what we need to start doing, and Elon Musk is leading the way in this with SpaceX, we need to start allowing these smaller firms with great innovative ideas to break into the procurement process. Elon Musk had to sue his way into the procurement process, and he's fighting an uphill battle. The average cost for a launch of military space systems is anywhere from $144 to $166 million per system. Elon Musk has gotten it down to about $80 million, and once he masters these reusable rockets, he'll be down to $40 or $44 million. That's a lot of bang for your buck, if you'll pardon the expression. Thomas Taverny has created the vicious circle of space acquisition. And he's a former Air Force general, and he now, I think he's actually part of Lockheed now, but he came up with this, basically, the way that the current procurement system operates at the Pentagon is it creates few program starts, expensive systems, where that creates no spares or backups. So if we lose one of these systems, good luck getting it back online in a timely fashion, which is why our enemies are targeting these systems in orbit. They are expensive to launch, and there are low launch rates. This has created strategic gaps, grave strategic gaps that in particular the Chinese are going to exploit. So here are some solutions that have been posited over the last few years. Create more and smaller, less complex satellites. They don't have to be fancy. Right now, the Pentagon, because of Cold War requirements and because we don't launch enough of them in a timely fashion, they basically throw as many capabilities into one satellite as possible. This creates a massive, oversized satellite that can't be launched on civilian rockets, that have to be launched on these expensive military satellites that the ULA uses, and half of these rockets use the Russian-built RD-180. The RD-180 has been a strategic pulley that the Russians have used to try to restrain us from checking them in Crimea. When they invaded in 2014, they basically said, hey, look, we know you guys need our rockets to launch your military satellites. If you try to sanction us because we took Crimea, we're going to prevent you from buying these rockets, and good luck getting an affordable replacement. Russia is considered the Walmart of space rockets. They can do anything at cost. Now, Elon Musk is getting there, but he's fighting an uphill battle because he doesn't have the Lockheed or Boeing imprimatur behind him, and he's considered disruptive. I like disruption, personally. We need mixed constellations. We need to be able to make military and civilian satellites better integrated. So if we do lose, God forbid, one of these military satellites, we can offload some of the workload onto a civilian satellite with very little data loss. We need to increase the constellation size, make it more difficult, and to create redundancy, make it more difficult for these enemies of ours to completely debilitate our satellite infrastructure, distribute capability. We also need to encourage, as I talked about, this low-cost launch, but then we also need to change export controls. Do you guys know, and ladies know, who is the best country that launches satellites at cost? India. India has proven over the last 3 years their space program is, I mean, it's really amazing stuff what they're doing. I sit in awe of the Indians. They were able to launch something like upwards of 100 satellites from multiple countries on one rocket last year. This stuff is amazing. At cost, it was cheaper than anything we're doing for either NASA or the military side. Another threat that we're facing today is from North Korea and Iran. Now, we know a lot about the North Korean nuclear program, but what we don't know, and this is true of Iran as well, what we don't acknowledge, and former CIA Director James Woolsey, and he was also the former chancellor at the Institute of World Politics up until about a year ago, he wrote a series of fantastic articles in the Washington Times, The National Interest, which basically documented his worry, and he's backed up by a litany of experts on this, that every time the North Koreans do these satellite launches for their peaceful space program, they're actually putting electromagnetic pulse bombs in orbit. Now, an electromagnetic pulse is a powerful wave that's emitted right before a nuclear bomb explodes, and it basically can wipe out all silicon-based technology, sends us back to the 19th century. When I was working on the Hill, there was a report floating around from the EMP Commission. That's what electromagnetic pulse is, EMP. The EMP Commission that said that worst case scenario, if the North Koreans were to detonate one of these things 50 miles above North America, that it would completely wipe out the power grid and all technology, and it would take, worst case scenario, 2 years to repair even the basic electrical grid, and in that time, upwards of 94% of the American population would be dead or dying. Now that's worst case scenario, but that's a pretty grim picture, and the optimistic scenarios are not that much better looking. And so, you know, he's a Bond villain. And so what we need to check this is we can't rely on the Chinese and Russians anymore. We need to put a space-based system, nuclear defense system, to knock these rockets out. We have the THAAD system, which is a ground-based interceptor. And that's a nice idea, but the problem is it's highly ineffective when you're talking about the kind of systems that not only North Korea and Iran can launch up, but the numbers that China or Russia could, God forbid, launch up at us in terms of nuclear or EMP weapons. And so a better solution, in my view, would be to go into that procurement process, lower the cost of doing business, inspire free market reforms, get competition going, so lower the cost on all space launches, because when you lower that cost, then you're going to get the innovators going into the Pentagon and saying, hey, look, why don't we put a rudimentary ballistic missile defense system up in orbit, because we don't want to have this Bond villain from Moonraker, launching EMPs and holding us hostage. I can totally see him putting a couple of these things in orbit and calling up Trump and saying, I want you to back down, or I'm going to detonate this thing and drop some letters from the alphabet because he's nuts. But I don't want to deal with this. There's another problem also. We're not maintaining a competitive edge. How many times have you been watching CNN and they tell you, Fareed Zakaria, we're living in a cooperative world. We are not living in a cooperative international environment. I mean, a lot of my work, academic work, is now about what's going on in Europe, and even the Germans and French are not really our friends. They are allies, but they don't have our best interests at heart much of the time. And I like this quote from Robert Kagan. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I like what he says about after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War did not see this is what he was critiquing for Francis Fukuyama about the end of history. It was a new utopia that was being built. And Robert Kagan over at American Enterprise Institute, he said no. He said at the end of the Cold War did not just end one strategic and ideological conflict, but all strategic and ideological conflict. People and their leaders longed for a world transformed, but that was a mirage. The world has not been transformed. In most places, the nation-state remains as strong as ever. And so, too, the nationalist ambitions, the passions, and the competition among nations that have shaped history. After watching the last few years of politics around the world, who can deny that this is not true? And so we need to start getting more competitive. We're living, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it is. I liked the hegemonic world that America was running after the Cold War. But we're now in the multipolar world. And that means we better start getting competitive. The Credit Suisse maps the power of the polls. We're number 5, the most powerful, but this is based on current trends. And China, they say, is 3. Again, I say China is our greatest threat in the long run. There's a parade of horribles, though. The challenges we're facing, instability in Latin America, our own backyard. Europe is no longer dependable. Despite spending over $500 billion a year on our military, where it's apparently the weakest it's been, because every military expert I hear on TV or in Congress keeps saying, my God, the sky is falling. American economic growth, this actually is, the number's been revised, it's a little bit above 3% in the last 2 quarters, but compare that to China's 6.7% growth, and that's a bad year for China. Our U6 number of unemployment, so the human capital is very big to me. It's the abilities that we have to bring to bear in the economic competition, which also translates to innovation on the tech side. Our unemployment numbers, the real unemployment, is 8.6%. That's those who cannot find a job but otherwise could be employed, or those who are underemployed. So this is not good. We lost our number 1 purchasing power parity position in 2014 to China. PPP, economists believe, is generally a better way to judge the strength of an economy than GDP. We're about to lose next year. Some people say by 2023, but anyway, in the next 4 or 5 years, I think it'll be next year, we're going to lose our number 1 GDP economic position to China, and that we're going to be the 2nd largest economy GDP terms for the first time in over 100 years, and I don't know how we get that back without a silver bullet, without something that's going to push the limits, and that silver bullet lies in space. And our political system's in gridlock. What else is new? KPMG is a consulting firm. You guys may be familiar with it. But they did a study that every 4 years they do it. It's the Global Tech Innovation Survey. And in 2012, they were asked to identify 4 years from that point, where would the new center of gravity in the innovation world be? And they predicted, it's a survey of about 800 international tech executives. These are guys who have no ideological barriers. They worry about dollars and cents. And so they were looking at the numbers and looking at their field, and they were saying it's going to lie somewhere between New Delhi and Shanghai. Well then 4 years later, or actually it was January of this year, they asked the same question to the same group of people. And they said China is now closing the gap with the United States and leading the development of disruptive technology breakthroughs. They also identified Shanghai as the city that will rival San Francisco along with California's Silicon Valley as the world's leading innovation hub over the next 4 years, so by 2020. The innovation economy in China is being energized by the technology disruptions that are occurring. What we've seen emerge over the time is the result of countries and cities striving to replicate and build on Silicon Valley's technology innovation blueprint and their increasing degree of success. In 2012, I saw Peter Thiel debate Eric Schmidt of Google. And Peter Thiel, who I love, Peter Thiel said, you know, Eric, he said, you're not really the president of a tech company anymore. You're the president of a glorified bank, because you're sitting on, at the time, $50 billion. You're not really reinvesting it much in American tech innovation. And Eric Schmidt made an interesting point. He said, well, you know, Peter, I would love to reinvest in the American tech innovation. He said, the problem is, there are barriers, i.e. regulatory burdens and high taxes, that just don't make much business sense for me to invest it here. Where is Google investing? Where is Apple investing in the new AI center? China. Anybody been to Shanghai in the last 10 years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Shanghai is completely a changed city. It is a true tech innovation hub. The KPMG survey got a lot of flack because they didn't include Shenzhen on their list, although they conceded they wanted to, but there was some back and forth. But China is Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Hong Kong are really taking the lead. And Hong Kong, by the way, has consistently been ranked as by the Heritage Foundation, the #1 economically free area in the world. America's at number 17 and declining. Why? Because our taxes and regulations are getting so darn high. China does not have these, communist China does not have these burdens. This is problematic. Because in China, they have a strategic posture, which is achieving President Xi Jinping's China Dream by 2049. China Dream is rich country, strong nation. Now that may sound like a benign thing, but it is not, because Colonel Lu Mingfu, who is a People's Liberation Army colonel, he coined this phrase, and he's retired now. He's a senior advisor to President Xi. They're fast friends. Lu Mingfu wrote a book called The China Dream. It was of course praised by the New York Times. It's a great book. But in the book, he said that it would be a good thing if the Chinese beat the Americans in this massive competition. He likened it to a marathon. Michael Pillsbury picked up with it. He was what they called in my field a panda hugger for a long time. He loved China. But now in the 90s, he started to change his opinion. He worked for Nixon for years and Kissinger. He wrote a book in 2015 called The 100-Year Marathon. It's incredible. I recommend everybody read it. But he picks up on this theme of the great marathon between China and America. And Colonel Lu Mingfu is explicit. He's written for the New York Times op-eds in which he said this. It would be a, quote, good thing for humanity for China to beat America. And that day will come by 2049. And let me tell you something. Innovation, tech, knowledge industries, that is where they're going to beat us. They've already got our number in the manufacturing sector. They're now pivoting and going into the white-collar sector, going into innovation. And if we lose our innovation advantages, we're done for. We will be a glorified France or, God forbid, Greece. The Chinese, this is according to a leaked document that a group called the Project 2049 got a hold of in Washington, D.C. It's now available on Amazon. They translated it. The Chinese have an explicit plan of invading Taiwan in 2020 and taking it. And the opening shots of this conflict will be to debilitate American satellites in orbit, not just military satellites, but civilian communication satellites as well. I'm sure you all have gone out and recently filled your gas tanks up with that very expensive California gas. You used your credit card or ATM, I'm sure. Some of that transaction was conducted instantaneously by sending signals through space. Imagine not being able to use your cell phone or do basic transactions because the Chinese have debilitated not just our military satellites, but our civilian satellites as well. This is a severe weak point. We are not, as Donald Rumsfeld said back in 2001 about this issue, he said, we are on notice, but we have not noticed. So we need a silver bullet. We need to get space weaponization and have a doctrine of willing to use it. We need to get permanent manned space presence in orbit and beyond. And then we need to look, because there's always a bright side to these things. I realize I'm talking a lot about pessimistic things, but there's a bright side. Our economy needs a jolt, as never before. The acquisition of space resources will be that jolt. By the way, the Chinese have already acknowledged that this is their ultimate plan with space, to both weaponize, dominate space from a military angle, and then dominate the natural resources found on the moon, the asteroids, and other celestial bodies in our solar system. And it's not just in 100 years. Beginning in 2020, the Chinese will begin mining operations on the moon. Right now, in January, they'll be launching their satellite to go to the moon and to test the soil. And then by 2023, if the soil pans out to have the requisite amount of helium-3, which is an isotope used for fueling nuclear reactions in a nuclear fusion device, about a canister yay big of refined helium-3 could potentially cleanly power a city the size of Shanghai or Manhattan for 15 years without needing to be replenished. This stuff is incredible. It is in abundance on the moon. It's a rare earth metal here, so it's highly expensive, which is why we haven't been able to upscale it using existing quantities on Earth. In fact, it's believed that what we know as rare earth minerals and metals on Earth are not quite rare on the moon and the asteroids and elsewhere. And it is such a prevalent topic that one of the things I was part of on the Hill was getting a bill passed in December of 2014. I'm forgetting the HR number now, I'm sorry, they all kind of bleed together when you work on the Hill. But this was a rather controversial piece because it for the first time allowed American private space companies that can make it to an asteroid to capture those asteroids, mine those asteroids, and sell the mined materials on Earth. This is huge. This is the future. It's predicted that the world's first trillionaire with a T will come from the space mining sector. China has state-owned enterprises. There is no such thing as a private Chinese enterprise. So it is the Communist Party. Can you imagine what happens if a Chinese space company, quote unquote, or the Chinese military space program takes the moon, takes asteroids, takes another moon in the solar system, and manages to commoditize the natural resources there, do you really think they're going to let us come up there and compete with them? I don't. This is frightful. We have got to start investing. We need a Manhattan-type project or an Apollo-type mission. We need a massive infusion of wealth from from both government and private sector. We need to blow open the regulations, deregulate the heck out of space, and get up there before the Chinese do, because darn it, we have the innovation and the capabilities today. But in another 5 to 10 years, we might not have those advantages. The Chinese we have watched, we started with a 40-year advantage over the Chinese. Then it withered down to 20, then down to 10. And I argue that they are only in specific industries, specifically space, they're only about 5 to 7 years behind us in space. I was telling two gentlemen here before the event, I had a friend in college who was an engineer, and he went to Germany to a trade show in 2013. And he came back, he said to me, he goes, Brandon, he said, I went to this trade show and there was a bunch of Chinese firms there showing off their new tech. He said, it's as good as anything we've got here in the West. And he goes, I know, it's what I do. And so, this is a frightful time. We have been put on notice, but we have not noticed. Here are some technologies China currently has to debilitate our space systems. Killer satellites, straight out of Moonraker. These are small satellites with grappling claws that can attach themselves onto our existing satellites and literally tear the insides out, rendering them inert. Goodbye the ability to order our forces into, say, a contested Taiwan Strait, or to save them. The Chinese in 2007, this is not well known, the Chinese in 2007 tested a ground-based laser system on one of our surveillance satellites passing overhead, blinded it for several hours. They did not destroy it. Why would they want to? They can easily blind us, and then because we don't have a manned spaceflight program to actually physically repair and replace satellites, we have to rely on the Russians. The satellite system, the only self-defense mechanism it has is to shut down and turn toward the sun and hope that a ground-based operator can link back up with it and remotely repair the damage. In the meantime, the Chinese could move forces across, because they are developing amphibious warfare capabilities quite well. They could easily move across the Taiwan Strait and take Taiwan. Now, whether or not that's our problem is irrelevant. We are duty-bound by treaty. I know it supposedly has a lot of loopholes, my friends who don't want us to intervene, but the fact is, we are duty-bound to defend them. And right now, we are not doing well enough in preventing such an event occurring, because we don't have the power in space. The Chinese disbelieve our deterrent factor right now, because they understand they've got our number right now in the tech, knowledge, and innovation hubs. And by the way, with their manned spaceflight program, they don't have a NASA. They have the People's Liberation Army rocket forces. They do not have a civilian space. And I understand that our NASA does work with the military and does do I get that. But at its core, it's a civilian scientific endeavor. It is. And that's good. Unfortunately, though, the Chinese don't believe in that. They don't. Space technology is dual use. So what we could use for civilian programs, they can switch and turn into a defensive system, or God forbid, an offensive system. They have right now 3 astronauts aboard their own Tiangong 2 space station, and they're testing right now an advanced laser system. They're also testing the EM drive. It's known as the impossible drive because we in the West stopped believing, and basically it's called the impossible drive because it supposedly violates Newton's third law of physics. It creates thrust from nothing. The Chinese have built this system, and they are testing it right now over our heads. If it works on the civilian side, it could get a manned spaceship from here on Earth to Mars in 70 days. So if you're looking for natural resources, because the big problem is fuel and distance, if you can overcome the distance problem, you can harvest those space systems. There's another thing. Satellites. If they put these offensive satellites with the grappling claws and whatever else into orbit, weapon systems, this drive, you can't detect it. It's a basically stealth drive in space. Right now we can track maneuvers in orbit. On this system we could not. And it's a very quick system. So this is a threat. There's another thing. The Sputnik moment already happened. It already happened last year when they placed their quantum internet satellite in orbit. And when they placed it in orbit, they said, give it a year and it'll live test. Of course, we in the West are going, not going to happen. A few weeks ago, it worked. They tested it. They sent a signal from Shanghai to Paris, worked like a dream. They've now figured out that quantum computing is the future because we're reaching the end of Moore's law, which says that every 18 months, the computing power of silicon-based computer chips doubles in size. If you look at this chart, we are reaching that threshold of not being able to rely on that any longer. They're trying to do 3D computing. Unfortunately, though, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's only going to kick the ball down the road a few years. So the Chinese, after they tested this quantum internet and it worked, they decided to double down and invest $10 billion in a new, beautiful new system, a new project in Anhui province, which is the Quantum Computing Institute, which is explicitly for military and national security issues. They will develop a quantum computer to replace the silicon-based computers that we use today. They are already well ahead of us. They're using the Boson sampling machine. They also, when you invest in new age technology, you guys are Silicon Valley, so you know this, it may not always work, but when it does, the development is non-linear and it happens at rapid speed. So once you break one hurdle, the next set of major innovations will be unpredictable, disruptive, and they will likely disproportionately benefit the country or company that dominates that industry. There's another thing that they were able to develop, the Chinese, the quantum radar. They announced this about 6 months ago. They're marrying it up to these big Russian S-400 air defense batteries. And the quantum radar can basically render that $1 trillion boondoggle that is the F-35 fifth generation fighter, they can render it naked. There is no such thing as stealth with quantum radar. You marry that to the S-400 or the S-500 system that China just bought from Russia, and they're going to be able to protect their sphere of influence from any abilities of the United States to intervene to protect an ally. And that means that, hello Chinese co-prosperity sphere, return of the tributary system, because we are not going to risk our troops if there's no hope that we can intervene reliably. Scott Amix said, he's a managing partner at Amix Ventures, he said, once quantum computers gain traction in the mainstream industry, they may become the biggest threat to the current industries and markets worth many billions of dollars. Alternatively, the potential of a fully functional quantum computer is so vast that one commercially viable quantum computer in production can unleash a havoc by creating a revolution more significant than the Industrial Revolution of the past century. The breakthrough in quantum computing has given China the lead. Again, on notice we are, but we have not noticed. In the highly competitive world of computing. Keeping the future in its sight, China is investing heavily in intellectual property and its development, which is a wise decision given the country is a fast emerging market. The Chinese have spent decades copying us, and I know this is what many detractors of what I'm talking about who don't want to spend the money on what I'm advocating. They say, yeah, but China's imitators. Read Odin Shankar's 2010 book, Copycats, please. It's short, it's great, it's eminently readable. He makes it, now he's talking about corporations in that book, but I think it applies to countries as well, particularly in the age of state-owned enterprise. He says that you give an imitating company, and I think again, it's country as well, you give an imitator enough time, they'll start to innovate. And when they start to innovate, watch out, because they're going to start to dominate, because they're able to cut down on R&D time and move ahead. Meanwhile, their competitors are still spending 25 or 30% of their budget on R&D. Now this is in Hefei, in Anhui province. This is the $10 billion research center. And this is the last part about space resources. I have no idea, I'm not a climatologist, I don't know anything about global warming, whether it's man-made or not, but what we do know is that there is a declining share of potable fresh water in the world. We know this. Look at the Aral Sea, that's because of human intervention, but we know in Eurasia specifically, and this is actually being linked to warfare, there is a dearth of fresh water. There's a guy named Brahma Shalani. He's written a book called, the picture doesn't show up, I'm sorry, called Becoming Water Wars. He's fantastic. And basically he talks about how water restriction is leading to geopolitical instability. There's a way we can overcome this. The celestial bodies throughout the solar system, asteroids, the moon, other moons, particularly Europa, which is an ice world. There's mineable ice there. If we can figure out a way to get there and mine it, we might be able to offset some of this. And whoever dominates that industry, just look at the bottled water industry. Whoever dominates that industry, there's a lot of money to be made. The Chinese are investing resources in part to go forward to mine this. Dr. Michael Burry, who predicted the '08 housing bubble, he was portrayed by Christian Bale in the great 2015 film The Big Short. He kind of got out after he made all his money shorting the housing market, but there's one thing that he's looking at doing, figuring out how to short the water. Figuring out how to short water. He wants to short that water market because he thinks there's a bubble there, for pardon the expression. Now, water's a utility, so it's a little bit different than, say, housing. But if he can figure, there's one guy who can figure it out, it's this guy. And he's California-based, I believe. And here's my contact info. There's a packet also that's on the table. There's about 6 articles here, 2 pages each, that I've written. Innovation, space, and space dominance. You can contact me at Brandon Weichert on Twitter, The Weichert Report on Facebook. That's Weichert. I'm also a contributing editor at American Greatness, which is a new conservative website. And also, as I noted earlier, the ERAinstitute.org. You can hear my first podcast there on Afghanistan. All of the stuff in Eurasia doesn't matter if we don't dominate the high ground of space. In warfare, the old parlance says, he who dominates the high ground controls the battlefield. The Chinese understand this, the Russians understand this, but their capabilities are declining. And the North Koreans and Iranians understand this. I don't know why we don't, but it'd be nice if we start. This is why I'm doing this. So, Q&A, if, I don't know.
Okay, please.
Yes, sir.
Is there any good news?
Well, you know, below, there's a few of us, but I am one of the few people who talk about this, and I have presented to Congress on other issues, and I'm trying to get to before Congress the space committee. I think if we can get this in the ear of political leaders, again, our problems are political. That's our problem. It's not economic, it's political and the bureaucracy. This is our problem. It is bipartisan. It has nothing to do with partisanship. It's bipartisan. We focus on the wrong things. There is a positive side. The current administration, and I'm not trying to get political here, but this is just a fact, they have reconstituted the Space Council. Vice President Pence last week announced that we are moving money. This is important because money is everything. We're moving money to do this, that within 4 or 5 years we will have another man on the moon. So we are starting to wake up. And Thomas Taverny, the vicious circle of that space acquisition guy, he is now a leading figure at the Pentagon. They've brought him in. He's no longer on the outside raging about this. They are bringing in a lot of people like me, older than I am, who have more seasoned experience than I do. But there are movements. The question is, given our system, short-termism, will it be enough? And another problem is cultural. I am a firm believer that Western culture is in decline because of certain decisions and things that have been done since the 1960s. Meanwhile, Chinese culture and strategic culture are on the ascendancy. Eamon Fingleton was an economist in the George H.W. Bush administration, and he's become a bit of a libertarian figure, so he's kind of considered fringe. I think he's brilliant, though. He's been wrong on some things, but I think he's been brilliant. He wrote a book in '08 called In the Jaws of the Dragon, and he talked about how the Chinese system, it has the trappings of a communist system, but it's actually become Neo-Confucian. They've started to reconnect with many of the Confucius principles of the past, and they've started to reintroduce Sun Tzu, the 36 stratagems. They really started to focus on their history to build up their future. Meanwhile, we in the United States, as John Wachowski talks about brilliantly, we in the United States have allowed ourselves to become delinked or deracinated from Western moral and civic traditions, and it shows. Somebody yesterday said that, well, it's a problem of democracy, and I counter, I said, no, it is not. It is most certainly not a problem of democracy, because this democracy of ours put men on the moon and won the Second World War. It's a problem of culture, and we have got to work on the strategic and the overall cultural problems. One thing I'll say, Peter Thiel, I love, he's just a wonderful man. Peter Thiel said a few years back at a talk, he said, look, there were two instances that happened almost back to back in the 1960s. We landed a guy on the moon and Woodstock. And these two issues were inflection points, not just for the United States, but for the future of Western civilization. We could have chosen to keep going to the moon and to keep going beyond that. True progress. Test the limits of mankind. Test the limits of America. Have America be the leader. Or we could go into hedonism and decadence and short-termism. We chose Woodstock. If we don't get into the culture today, and this is not a Democrat or Republican thing, by the way, because guys like in the past, he worked Scoop Jackson and guys like that, and Pat Moynihan in the past. These Democrats, they talked about this too. If we don't save the culture, there is no future. There's no military, because Michael Walsh talks about this. There's a politics, economy, military. This is all downstream from culture. If you don't have the culture, you don't have anything. Our enemies have their culture under control. They understand it. They use it to their advantage. It's a source of strength. And I think that there's hope, though, but I think we've got to start focusing. And the one thing I will say, again, I'm not trying to be political, is the last election broke a lot of the old political talking points for both parties. Look at what happened in Virginia. Ed Gillespie is a scion of the Republican establishment. He's not winning. Look at Bernie Sanders. Now, I have disagreements with him, but he was definitely not a scion of the Democratic establishment. He almost won their party. So we are moving beyond the old stilted talking points that I think have no longer any relevance to our time today, and that basically are holding us back. We are forcing political change with whether we realize it or not in both parties, and I think this is good for the most part. And so I think there's hope. I do, but we need to keep having this conversation. Yes, sir.
Given the competitive environment you described between the United States and China, what do you think the likelihood is that we can convince China to help us vis-a-vis North Korea?
I think that China, and these are not my words, these are the words of my friend, again, David Goldman, China is acting as both the arsonist and the fire brigade when it comes to dealing with North Korea. North Korea, so your point is understood, and I actually several months ago wrote an article hopeful that maybe we would be able to convince the Chinese to help us. The Chinese are very much both afraid of North Korea. They don't want to risk the refugee issue coming across their borders, destabilizing their country. They don't want to risk agitating Kim Jong-un, who is unstable. And so I think, and also they like the strategic lever. Anytime China starts to do something aggressive against us, they know they have a crazier guy they can point our attention to, which is right below them in North Korea, which is exactly what's happening. What happened as North Korea was going on? China tried, and they will succeed eventually. This is like their third attempt in as many years. Tried to buy out a bulk of the American semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are the only quantifiable strategic advantage technologically that we still have over the Chinese. And the Chinese know that. And so while North Korea was happening, they were trying to get in there and buy these semiconductor firms that are American-based. And they almost did, if it wasn't for the fact that the White House stepped in because of the overall protectionist policies they believe in. It rankled them, so they managed to stop it. But eventually, I know because I worked down the hill, I know K Street, eventually, enough influence will get through that we will lose the semiconductor industry. If we don't have space as a backup, it's going to be goodbye supremacy, hello parity, and then eventually goodbye parity, hello second-class status. So I have very little faith. This is why I think that the ultimate stopgap is a space-based missile defense system. We can't rely on the Chinese or the Russians to do much of anything, partly because they act as the arsonist and fire brigade, and also because they actually don't have as much control as some people think. They don't. And in the case of Russia, they are a decline. They are the Ottoman Empire in its last years. So don't buy into this notion, Russia, Russia, Russia. The Russians are declining. They are declining. We have to manage that decline. The Chinese are, by the way, quite effectively. Yes, sir.
Brandon, what are some of the organizations or think tanks, either within the government or outside of it, that are looking at strategic answers to some of the issues that you raised?
There are none in the government. Government does not want to think about this. There are individuals, and I talked about some of them, and they're starting to congregate together, like the old church in the Roman Empire and underground with the candles. But there are none in the government, and unfortunately, as we've seen with Google and Apple, there's too much of a willingness on the part of American tech companies to abandon the United States and go work in China. And to be fair, look, I could sit here and lecture innovation companies as much as I want, but I understand why they're doing it, because they have a fiduciary responsibility to do so. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their bottom line. We don't incentivize these companies to stay here and do business here, across the board, not just in the tech sector, just about every sector. Why are we not having more innovation? My wife worked in biotech. Why are we not having more innovation with curing cancer? Well, it's because it's too much money to invest in a new cure. They have to go through the gamut of FDA regulations, and it's a ridiculous amount of money. In China, if you want to do business, I spoke about my friend who went to Germany at the trade show. When I was on Capitol Hill, I met the owner of the largest factory in Hubei. Well, I can't say it right, I'm sorry, but it was in the heartland of China. And he was talking to me about tariffs. And he said, Brandon, look, he said, not only do I get low-wage workers to do, a lot of work, he said, the Chinese government gives me a 17% subsidy to do business in their country. He goes, where else am I going to get that? He goes, this is great. I'm getting paid by China to work there. We don't do that. I'm a free market guy too, but at some point, you need to incentivize from the government some of these corporations to stay here, to do business. One of the things that we've seen with the current administration is the repatriation. That's a good thing. I realize my libertarian friends go, yeah, but it's decreasing efficiency, but darn it, at some point, it's not all about efficiency. How many companies in World War II in the United States, we talked about this a lot yesterday, how many companies in World War II abandoned the bottom line to help the country out? There's a great book, his last name, he was on Tucker Carlson's show in April. It was called The Golden Compass or The Golden Carrot. And he was from UPenn. He was a business guy, and he wrote a book castigating the Harvard Business School model of agency theory. And he said that we have what's known ever since the 80s as shareholder capitalism, which only focuses corporate leaders on the bottom line of the next quarterly profit. He said we've got to figure out a way to get back to getting our corporate leaders to think a little bit larger, to think a little bit long term. Chinese corporate leaders don't have this problem because they're owned by the state. In fact, one of the largest telecom companies in China is owned and operated by a former People's Liberation Army Signals Corps general. And he was talking to, again, my friend David Goldman. He was talking to David Goldman, who was on tour of this new telecom facility. And he said to him, he goes, I can see with this technology, every single cell phone in Shanghai, I can, with facial recognition, see who's using these phones. He said, my company's empowering the state, and I'm proud of it. I don't know where that drive is from American corporate leaders. And that's not a knock on them because, again, the incentive system is different. But we've got to get the government to start helping out in terms of incentivizing. You don't even have to do subsidies. You can just create a system of tax breaks to get these companies to stay here. The thing is, with our infrastructure, with our laws, because China's legal system is a disaster, we have an inherent advantage to get these corporations to, they want to do business here. They want to send their kids to private American schools. They don't want to go live in China, but they have to. They have to. And when you incentivize them, guess what? They onshore. They come back. You've seen that. And so there is no group in the government. The government is, the space policy community in particular is dominated by a stifling utopianism. On the military side, they want to keep space as a sanctuary. Weapons-free sanctuary. God help us if we don't put weapons there because we could blow ourselves up. But I'm looking at North Korea and Iran and I'm saying they're going to blow us up anyway if we don't have space weapons up there. And on the economic side, the adoration of international treaties, outer space treaty in particular, forbids us from commoditizing space. The reason that we passed these rules was to placate the Soviet Union during the Cold War, because we wanted them, the State Department and their love of treaties. They wanted to do whatever they could to get the Soviets and the Third World that was run by the Soviets to sign on, so they had to embrace a Marxist definition of res communis, which is the theory of an international commons for trade, which basically forbade American private sector from doing business in space. They disincentivized at the government level. No one is really talking about this. There are not many people who are interested in this. This is what my niche is. I'm trying to set up some stuff to allow me to keep doing this. Unfortunately, no one's really interested yet. I write about it. I want to get some groups going from IWP. I want to get some things going on my own, but it's probably, I'm having problems right now. I wrote a book on the issue, and I'm fighting an uphill battle with the publisher. Nobody wants to talk about this. It's politically incorrect. I don't think I'm politically incorrect, but people do.
Have you been able to testify in the Senate? Or?
Not on this, no. I worked previously on the Hill, so I have some contacts, but nobody will touch this with a 10-foot pole. I do think I can get through eventually if I get enough mass going. I'm very much a grassroots. Matt Daniels talked about how he has low overhead. I have really low overhead right now. I'm a one-man band right now, but I believe in this, and if we don't come into space in the next, I would say 5 to 7 years, really go into space, we're not going to be here. The one upside is I have an article pending on Space News, which is a very well-respected industry publication. They're going to publish it in the next issue. And it was on this proposal. The Russian NASA, Roscosmos, went to NASA and said, we'd like to begin building a joint lunar space station to use as a platform to launch missions onto the moon. The ESA, European Space Agency, is now heavily involved. The Indians, thank God, are coming to our rescue, and they're getting involved. I actually think, I'm a bit of a contrarian on this, I'm not a fan of Russia. I don't think Russia's our friend, but I do think that Russia being a declining power and being more threatened by China than we are, I think that we can actually get Russia to our side and maybe help to triangulate against China. The Chinese do not want a resurgent Russia in their backyard. They want the Russian Far East. Russia's silver bullet, like us, is in space. If we start cooperating on space, we can build from that. We can start to jointly develop things, create a lot of money in the process. I like to make money. Create a lot of money for everybody in the process. It's a risk, but at this point, we've rested on our laurels for so long that we have to take big, bold risks. We can't do incrementalism anymore. It is not possible.
You can tell your publisher that you just sold another book today.
I might self-publish at this point. Thank you.
The question is, the left moved out of Woodstock and similar sorts of experiences, Haight-Ashbury, into the education system in the United States. And as you know, and probably most people in this room, we don't do Western Civ, major
we do at IWP. We do at IWP.
Well, the ignorant universities in the United States. So how do we basically turn around the decline of the education system in the U.S. to teach Western civilization?
Well, first of all, it starts also with learning also the basics of science and math as well. It isn't just Western civilization. We're finding our kids can't do much of anything. I say this again as the father of two young daughters, and my oldest daughter, Charlotte, always says, she's 2.5, I want to be a pilot and be the first woman on the moon. And so I'm trying to instill in her not just a love of history and Western Civ. I think it starts at home. We're seeing, my wife and I are heavily involved with our church. And I'm not getting religious here, but there's in the church, and we have a very highly torqued population at First Alexandria Baptist. A lot of our friends homeschool their kids, and their kids are leaps and bounds ahead of the children in private school, and even private school as well. And I'm not trying to sell anybody on it, because I certainly understand the resistance to it, some of it. But I'm a firm believer it starts at home. It starts at home. You've got to parent your kids, you've got to teach them to have a love for these things. I benefited because When I was young, my parents did not have much money, and we lived with my mother's father and mother for about a year. And my grandfather was an ex-Navy intel man who wanted to fight the Ruskies till he was dead. And he was on the USS Forrestal, was there for the fire, saved a bunch of people. And he had a love of history, unlike anyone, my father does as well, unlike anyone I've ever known. And it's through them that I fell in love with what we know to be Western, I didn't know it at the time, Western civilization and the history, and from there it all built up. I wish I had a better love of math, I probably would off, but I think it starts at home. And I think that that's where the cultural aspects, it's not just space, unfortunately, we can't pigeonhole this thing. It's full spectrum.
In the short term, we've got a lot of pluribus, but very little una.
That's right. That's
what
right.
can we do to get back to e pluribus?
Well, it's a slow build. It's one of those things where we've got to hit the grassroots level. Not just Republicans, and we have to somehow figure out how to find those conservative. And I think we did find the blue dog, the conservative Democrats this last election, who voted for Trump overwhelmingly, the same group that voted for Reagan overwhelmingly, which were actually blue-collar Democrats. We've got to build from the working folk who understand inherently understand the tradition, the importance of traditionalism. And this is a long-term thing. I think if we could get a private, I don't really know, get a private fund going to start funding some, at a grassroots level and start from the ground up. That more than anything will build the foundation. If you don't have a foundation, you collapse. And so it isn't just about the tech and the math, though that's important. In the short term, I think we just need to start teaching math and science better. I know, because I did not get taught math and science well as a young man. I can do it now, but it was hard work. We've got to instill a love for that stuff. And not just in Western Civ, but we have to do it in the sciences as well. And so it's a long-running thing. I wish there was an easy answer, but again, we've rested on our laurels for so long. It has to be a concerted effort of a dedicated minority. It has to be. Bipartisan, dedicated minority. IWP is one of the seedlings of that, I think. Hillsdale as well. I have friends at Hillsdale. But there aren't many, but we can start there and go from there. It took, 40 years for the left to fundamentally reorient the culture. It's probably going to take 40 or 50 years to do the same. Thank you.